Hello, I'm Corinna Harrod and this is the Monday Night Review. Hello and welcome to episode 116 of the Monday Night Review. I'm sorry for our absence last week. Life just got in the way. It's partly because I do think I said now the boys were back at school, everything scheduling would return to normal. So it's just the universe's way of keeping me in check. I've got a limited time to record this in. I hadn't fully intended for this to be on a Monday, obviously, but now we've slipped into Tuesday and I have somewhere to be. So we're going to get straight into it. Today we're going to talk about the horrible but also slightly frustrating case of Sophie Tuscon de Plantier. There is a lot to be found on this. Quite a good Netflix documentary called Sophie has a lot of the information and a lot of footage, which was interesting to watch. There's books, there's articles, there's a lot. It's also been covered in numerous podcasts. I'm going to try and just focus on the facts, things that I know for sure or things that seem to be confirmed. There is a very definite outcome to this unsolved case, but I'd be interested to know what you think. We're going to Shull today, a picturesque coastal village located in County Cork in the southwestern part of Ireland. It's situated on the Mizzen Peninsula, known for its rugged beauty, its picturesque countryside with rolling hills, green fields and small farms with stunning views of the Atlantic Ocean. It's a beautiful, isolated spot known for fishing and farming with very little crime. One journalist called it, quote, the safest place in Ireland, and a local describes the town as, quote, an open-minded coastal community. You can't become stagnant when there's an ocean outside your door. It's a very cosmopolitan area. There are artists. It's very accepting of people who feel that maybe they would be excluded from communities in other areas come to Shull and fit right in there. One writer who lived in the area for many years said it attracted, quote, the lost children of Europe. It's overlooked by Mount Gabriel, which is shrouded in legends and mysteries. It's said that the last wolf in Ireland lived up there. It has standing stones, stone circles. You can see ruins of old stone houses. There are no roads up there. It's a sort of very magical place. And Shull is this small, close-knit community. And this is where French television producer Sophie Tuscon de Plantier finds a holiday home. Sophie was born on the 28th of July 1957 and lived in Paris at the time with her husband, film producer Daniel Tuscon de Plantier, and her son from her first marriage. Sophie's aunt would later say that she cried all day on the day of Sophie's wedding to Daniel. She had this premonition, this feeling that something was terribly wrong. She wasn't comfortable with Daniel's lifestyle. She said that Sophie liked to be alone. She didn't like to be in the media, and Daniel is a very famous film producer. So they have this sort of glamorous lifestyle, out every night, always being photographed, celebrity friends, and Sophie needed an escape, and this is what drew her to Ireland. She'd lived with an Irish family for some time when she was a teenager and had fallen in love with Cork. She bought the cottage in 1993, visiting regularly with her son. She often visited alone, and when looking for a house, she had seen her cousin had gone to look at houses with her and had seen this beautiful cottage in a valley surrounded by rolling green fields, and then they'd gone to see the house in Shull, and she was drawn to this unsettled, isolated location. There's no electricity, no heating, the wind blows onto the house. Sophie herself described the landscape as violent. Her friends and family think that's what appealed to her, this remote, stormy, romantic area. Sophie is incredibly intelligent and talented, but she did have this dark side to her that gave her depth. She was an incredibly talented writer. She was working on a project about bodily fluids, sperm, breast milk, blood. She was sort of had this depth that made her very interesting and intriguing and unusual. On the 20th of December 1996, Sophie arrived on her own for a quick stay with plans to return to Paris for Christmas. Though usually more than happy to take the trip by herself, this time she'd asked friends and family members to go with her. None of them could. She'd asked her cousin, who was away with work, her aunt, who'd had terrible flu and was on a drip as a result, so couldn't go. Her best friend's mother was visiting Paris, and they all were quite surprised that she'd made a particular point of asking them, because she used to go alone. She's only going for a couple of days. So she goes. Worth mentioning, although I've never seen the neighbours interviewed or read of them being interviewed, her house is incredibly remote, but she does have one neighbour. She's down this country road, this curved country road, and then her house is off down a track, up a track, and behind her house is another house, and that is her neighbour, Alfie Lyons. He's going to come into it later. So although she is very much in a remote, isolated spot, there is one other neighbour there. On the 22nd of December, Sophie visited Three Castle Head for a walk. She's only there for about an hour. There are some pretty dark tales associated with Three Castle Head. It's believed that the last family to live there, the O'Donohues, all died by suicide or murder. And now, as a result, a drop of blood falls from one of the towers every day. Sophie's friend Yvonne Unger later told the police that Sophie had visited them on the afternoon of the 22nd and said she'd been to the ruined castle and saw something terrible, and it scared her. She was visibly terrified. She also called her family and told them what she'd seen. She'd seen a woman in white. Now, it's said in local legend that if you see the white lady, you will die within hours. And a number of people said if an Irish family knew what she'd seen, they would not have let her go home. But the Ungars didn't know of the legend, and they comforted her. They weren't aware of what was supposedly going to happen, and Sophie goes on her way. But her cousin and her brother, I believe, both received phone calls from her about what she'd seen. On her way home, Sophie has tea at O'Sullivan's pub, where she's known by the locals and the landlord. She sort of goes there quite often, and then she goes home. On the morning of the 23rd of December, Sophie Tuscon de Plantier is found dead by a neighbour at about 10 o'clock in the morning. Her body is clad in nightwear and boots in a lane beside her house. Her long john bottoms were caught on a barbed wire fence, and there were bloodstains visible on a gate, as well as nearby pieces of slate and a concrete block. One of the first journalists on the scene was a man from Cork, and it was very noticeable that he is a local man and he had trouble finding even the town of Shull. He then had to stop numerous times to ask for directions to the house. It is really isolated. He isn't the first journalist on the scene, though. The first journalist is a local blow-in called Ian Bailey, and he lives 3 miles up the road from Sophie. It's not just the media who struggle to find the place. The local police station is very inexperienced. They're not prepared. The local police are unable to deal with this. They have not had any experience of anything like this. So they call in the police headquarters in Dublin. And what with the location and the fact that there is Christmas traffic, the Dublin police take 5 hours to get there. And when they arrive, the local police station is closed because everyone is at the scene. So the Dublin police then have to go to the local phone box to find out where the police are. This has been vandalised. So the police has to rewire the phone so that then they can call and find directions. And when they arrive, it's already dark. Sophie's body is still there on the side of the road. It's been there for a minimum of 12 hours. There is a lot of criticism in this case over how the police handled it. But mostly this is all down to their complete lack of experience. And you cannot fault them for this. They're the police of this quiet community. Everyone knows everyone. And there is very low crime. Anyone who is a hard-boiled homicide police investigator is not going to necessarily be drawn to this quiet coastal community. Indeed, for the town and the surrounding area, this is the first murder in living memory. Sophie's body was left outside until the state pathologist, Dr. John Harbison, arrives 28 hours later. The crime scene is not preserved. People are tramping all over it. Harbison found, quote, laceration and swelling of the brain, fracture of the skull, and multiple blunt head injuries caused by a heavy object. A blood-stained concrete block is found at the scene. The facial injuries are so severe that her neighbour could not formally identify her. Sophie has defence wounds from holding her hands up, which could have happened also from the loose gravel and big bushes of briars where her body has been dragged. And police know that her attacker would have had visible scratches from the thick briars and possibly other wounds from her trying to defend herself. What is handled badly is how her family find out. They hear about it on the news. They don't hear her name. They just hear that a Frenchwoman has died in West Cork. And so they panic, they ring her, they try and get hold of her. They can't get hold of her. Sophie's brother calls Josephine, Sophie's neighbour, repeatedly. Her phone is always engaged, and eventually he gets through, and Josephine's absolutely hysterical. He can't understand what she's saying. And eventually he just says, is it Sophie or is it not? And she says, yes, it's Sophie. And that's how her family find out. Sophie's son, who's 50 at the time, he's away with his father. When he's told the news, he was incredibly close with his mother. They'd got a divorce when the son was 1. And so he'd spent most of the time living with his mother. And he describes finding out about her death as the transformation of life from childhood to adulthood. Garda Chief Superintendent Noel Smith is head of the investigation, but the man in charge on the ground was Detective Inspector Dermot Dwyer, described as the Irish Columbo, which I was a bit like, oh yeah, there's one picture of him wearing a trench coat. But actually, if you see him interviewed, there is something Columbo-ish about him. From what they could tell, Sophie had come out of the house dressed for bed. Her keys were on the lock on the inside and the door was closed. So she'd obviously opened the door to someone, somehow been enticed outside, and then the door had closed with her keys on the inside. She'd been rolled or pushed into the vegetation, and the killer would definitely have cuts on their hands, but also bloodstains on their clothing. There was a lot of blood. But apart from this, clues are very few. They have one footprint giving an approximate shoe size. It's not a full print. They have blood on the metal gate. The gate is removed and taken away for evidence. And then when they search the house, they find nothing disturbed. No sign of an assault in the house. Everything is neat and tidy. They do find that 2 wine glasses have been washed up, and that leads them to believe that perhaps she had someone there for a glass of wine. Now, when I've listened to this on other podcasts, I imagined it a lot differently. So I imagined that there were two used wine glasses, or, it was quite obvious that they'd been used at the same time, like she had been entertaining. But when I see crime scene photos, it's on the side after having been washed up, two glasses upside down, drying on the drying rack. And there are other things there as well. I believe there's a coffee pot and something else. And I wonder if she'd had a glass of wine the night before, washed up the wine glass, put it on the drying rack, and then had a glass of wine when she got home, washed it up and put it on the drying rack. To me, when I saw it, I was like, oh, it's not as definite as I had thought that she'd been entertaining. She may well have just automatically gone to the cupboard, got a glass, and poured herself a glass of wine without using the glass that she'd just washed from the night before. If that makes sense to you. It wasn't as clear cut as I had thought. Again, they find her door keys in the back lock of the door. So they believe she must have answered the door, opened it by turning her key in the lock. They were things they noted, which they found unusual, was that she had no curtains in the house. She loved the lighthouse that was visible from her home. And in her bedroom, she'd had a traditional box bed made, a raised country-style bed, and she had no windows, and she loved to no curtains, and she loved to lie in bed, read her book, and look out at the lighthouse. Now, I have friends who sleep with the curtains open. I quite often sleep with the curtains open. I do not like not having curtains. And I used to have a house in North Norfolk, and there was nothing between us and the sea, except for a seawall path, but there were, no buildings. And when I renovated the house and moved in, there were no curtains. And weirdly, for me, there feels like a very stark difference between having curtains that you choose to leave open and not having any curtains. And it did make me feel uncomfortable. And one of the policemen is interviewed and is asked, could people see in? And he was like, absolutely, you could see in. Now, she's in a very remote and isolated spot, so there's no one to see in. But had there been someone stalking her or interested in her, they would have been able to sit and watch what she was doing. So this was noted. They dust for fingerprints. There's no indication of anyone else in the house. And again, I think that to me points to the second glass of wine not being that suspicious. There's no, if you go to someone's house, even if you're planning on killing them, I think you can't help but touch some things. But also, I guess it depends on the surfaces you're touching. Not all surfaces can be fingerprinted. Although DNA evidence, the use of DNA evidence was still, new-ish, they needed a lot of physical evidence to be able to get any DNA information from it. There just wasn't enough of anything. So, as is customary, the police set up an incident room and they start the house-to-house visits. They go to every house within 10 miles. They ask everyone what they're doing between 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., 22nd, 23rd of December, 1996. And they interview about 1,000 people. They get 54 possible suspects. They narrow this down to 10. Everyone has an alibi. And the thing is, I suppose, although it's a terrible time for this to happen because it really taints Christmas for the family and for people involved, most people do know what they're doing around that time because it's a time for parties and seeing family and that kind of thing. So it does mean that you're more likely to know what you're doing on the 22nd, 23rd of December than, say, the 20th of April. So Sophie's family arrive on Christmas Day. On the 26th of December, her brother goes to formally identify the body, and she has been so badly beaten that he doesn't recognise her. He obviously does know it's her, but he just said it was absolutely terrible, and he very touchingly talks about how, his mother, he says, my mother cannot see this, not because of her face, but he said her hands were so scratched. My mother cannot see her hands. It just must have been so awful. And of course, there are journalists everywhere. And as is customary, any journalist who is local, when new journalists come in, because obviously there are also French journalists arriving, they go to the local journalist, the person who knows all the information, and that person is Ian Bailey. He had worked as an investigative journalist in London. He'd been married previously. That marriage had fallen apart, and we don't exactly know why he's in Shul, but he carries on doing investigative bits of writing from there. I suppose it can't be that investigative because he's not traveling a lot, but he's doing writing from there, and he's still doing freelance journalism. And so Ian Bailey believes that something must have happened in France. He thinks that that's where they'll find an answer, and he begins digging into Sophie's private life, and he prints a lot of what turns out to be nonsense. And that sort of becomes his thing. He believes that it's all coming from France. It's all to do with her husband. Now, Daniel Toussaint de Plantier is a very famous figure. He's eloquent, he's intelligent, he knows the president at the time, Jacques Chirac. He's friends with all the great and the good in Paris high society. Sophie's family say that behind closed doors he's quiet and silent. There's suggestions that he had money problems. And what was very noticeable is that Daniel did not go to Ireland. He did not speak to any journalists, but he did not travel to Ireland when his wife died. And for a lot of people, this is very strange. If your wife dies, don't you go? It seems strange to a lot of people at the time, and it adds fuel to the fire that started by Ian Bailey, that there must be something going on in Sophie's relationships. He printed that she had a string of lovers going to the house, and implied that it was something to do with that caused her death. Now, some years before, Sophie had an affair. She had told her cousin that she was leaving Daniel for another man, Bruno Cabernet. Daniel knew about the affair. They basically separated, and she went to live with Bruno. But when she started living with him, he showed himself to be... He showed his true colours, basically. And she found him to be possessive and mean. And in Christmas 1993, she ends the relationship, and it's acrimonious. He's not happy. He assaults her in Paris, and he's not a nice man. And she goes back to Daniel. Their marriage continues. This is the last time she's known to have an affair. It doesn't mean it's the only time she had an affair, but it seems that she was sort of fairly out in the open about it. She had separated from Daniel. He hadn't done anything. When they hear of the murder, Sophie's friends and family believe it must be Bruno Cabernet, because he had taken the breakup terribly. He admitted that he had taken the breakup terribly. He willingly answered questions from the police. He said he'd last been to Ireland in the summer of 1993, and he had a solid alibi putting him in France at the time of the murder. Wasn't enough for Ian Bailey, though. He took it further. He stated in the paper that Sophie had been killed by a hitman hired by Daniel. Daniel, worried about losing half of his estate in a divorce, had hired a hitman, enabling him to collect on the extensive life insurance policies on his wife. But Sophie's friends and families said there's no indication that they were getting a divorce or that Sophie was seeing anyone else. The fact that Daniel refused to go to Ireland to answer police questions, again, added fuel to this fire started by Bailey. But Sophie's best friend travelled to the south of France to help Daniel organise the funeral, and she said that he was genuinely devastated, and she believes that that's what stopped him going. She thinks that he just couldn't get it together. He was inconsolable. He couldn't accept that he wasn't with her when she died. He felt incredibly guilty, and she believes that having seen him, that, you know, he was unable to go to Ireland. And I think that's the thing. We often hear, if you listen to a lot of true crime podcasts or anything like that, or even in fiction, you often hear of these amazing stories of people, but some people are not brave in the face of death, and that's not their fault. And I think that is worth a mention. Some people cannot keep it together. Some people are unable to be brave at times when everyone would judge it necessary. So the police obviously want to interview Daniel, but they know that he has an alibi. They know that Bruno Cabernet has an alibi. They are struggling. On the 27th of December, a woman is visited by the police in their routine visits. You know, they're speaking to everyone in the area, and she said that she knew Sophie. Sophie had been in her shop on the 21st of December, and when she'd waved goodbye to Sophie, she had noticed a man standing across the road from the shop wearing a long black coat, and she didn't recognise him. And she noticed that he followed Sophie, and she stood on the step of her shop and watched him as he sort of followed her, and it didn't sit right with her. And indeed, the whole town became uneasy. Shull became uneasy. People were afraid, understandably. And part of that was because a murderer in your midst is always seen as other. But this community is made up of others. There's a lady interviewed who moved there with her 3 children because she was a lesbian, and she felt that was a community that would be accepting of her, and it was. But she suddenly felt like, oh, hang on, am I being suspected? There was another lady who lived there with her mixed race children. She obviously felt that was a lovely community for her to bring her family up in. But again, for Ireland in 1996, it is other, and so people are just feeling very uneasy. And I thought it was so noticeable that one of the policemen, who was a local policeman, said, everyone knows everything. So everyone knew that this story about a string of lovers going to Sophie's door was nonsense. Everyone knows everything, but everyone stays in their own lane. There's not a lot of gossip. There's not a lot of tittle-tattle. Everyone knows everything, but everyone knows it's not their business. Then on the 11th of January 1997, the police received a phone call from a lady calling herself Fiona, saying that she'd been driving across the bridge, the Kilfadder Bridge, on the night of the 22nd of December, and she had seen something. It was about 3:00 in the morning. The Kilfadder Bridge is slightly further along the road from Sophie's house, and she had seen this man waving his arms around He seemed to be drunk. The police managed to trace this call, but it comes from a phone box. Fiona then calls again from another phone box to say, a bit more. She then calls a third time, and this time they trace the call back to her house. She speaks to the police, and it turns out she's the lady who saw Sophie in the shop. She then later in January is herself shopping, and she's bending down to pick something up, and she looks up and she sees the man in the long black coat who she's seen by the bridge. And she's so shocked to see him that she walks out she puts her shopping basket down, she walks out onto the street, finds a policeman and points the man out. And the policeman knows exactly who the man is. The policeman identifies that man as Ian Bailey. So Ian Bailey, as we know, is a local journalist. He lives about 3 miles down the road from Sophie on the same road. And he'd initially moved into the studio on the land belonging to a lady who owned a bit of land and a house there. He'd moved into her studio as a sort of lodger, and they began a relationship. This lady's called Jules, and he then moves from the studio into her house. He, from the get-go, has maintained that it's something to do with her love life, that it was a hitman sent over by her husband. But for everyone else, any journalist, and for the police, the murder of Sophie Tuscon de Plantier is committed by someone who knows the area, who relied on a concrete block or a slate. They hadn't taken a weapon with them. It's just not a hit. Bailey has constantly been throwing the police off by giving them theories about what he would call the French connection. And if you looked at the journalism of the time, all of these stories of the French connection, of a hitman, of anything like that, all comes back to Ian Bailey. None of the other journalists go in that direction because it just has no legs. Remember, we were talking about the journalist at the beginning who was from Cork, who had to stop and ask directions, not only to Shul, but then had to stop and ask directions twice more to get to Sophie's house. This is not a French hitman who has come over, managed to find the house, manages to entice her out of the house. How? And then hasn't bought a weapon. It is very weird to keep believing that this is a possibility. A policeman who had visited Ian Bailey for routine questioning when they were going around and interviewing everyone noted that he had serious scratches on his arms and hands, and he asks Bailey how he got them, and Bailey said he had been chopping down a Christmas tree. And the policeman was so wary of this. He didn't have a camera, time before smartphones, so he actually drew a diagram. He drew round a hand and he drew a diagram of where the scratches were. They then spoke to a witness who came forward who had shaken hands with Bailey on the traditional Christmas Day swim that the whole town participates in. And she noted there were deep scratches on the back of his hands. And she said, quote, there was a uniformity to them. There are 4 or 5 scratches across the back of his hand. He also had a nick on his forehead near his hairline that he said he got from killing turkeys. They were selling turkeys that year, and he'd got scratched by one of the turkeys while he was trying to kill it. Ian Bailey is 6'3". He's a very recognisable figure in the village. He's got longish dark hair. He's quite an arrogant attitude. He's quite obsessed with being other, with being sort of unusual and intellectual. He has a habit of reciting his own terrible poetry at people and in the pub. He's not much liked. He's quite eccentric, but it's a sort of forced eccentricity. And as strange stories from separate people kept coming in to the police, the circumstantial evidence against Bailey keeps mounting. A TV crew goes to the area to film a reconstruction of the crime, and they are in quite a remote area. And Bailey approaches them saying, did they need any help from him? He was the local expert on the crime. They said no thanks. They tried to ignore him, but he hung around and he kept saying things to the lady who was acting the part of Sophie, saying things like, I met her on this walk a few weeks before she died, etc. Remember this for later. Now, for some, a person inserting themselves into an investigation is something to be suspicious of, but a former colleague of Bailey's said that, he was a very tenacious journalist. She describes him as being, quote, a natural at getting information out of people. So for her, him being present and having these theories and talking to the police and all of that is not unusual. This is what a journalist would do. They would go to the TV crew who are doing the reconstruction. They would be everywhere. They would be asking questions. But the circumstantial evidence has mounted up, and Ian Bailey is arrested in February 1997 and taken in for questioning. And he would say that he was being harassed by the police. The police were like, why would we harass him? We want answers to some very strange questions that we have. And we want to know how there is so much circumstantial evidence about him. So let's have a look at this circumstantial evidence. A lot of it's to do with the timeline, so it can get a bit jumpy. On the 26th of December, Bailey goes through police tape and gets to Sophie's house by pretending to visit her neighbour. He had to tell the police that he was delivering milk to Alfie Lyons. Alfie Lyons would deny to the police that he had requested Bailey to deliver anything, and he wasn't in on the 26th anyway. While he's there, Bailey goes into the house. He gets into the house. In early talks with papers, he was talking about things that nobody knew. How did he know that there were 2 wine glasses on the washing up rack? How did he know that she'd been killed by blunt force trauma and that she'd not been sexually assaulted? Bailey seemed to know this before anyone else did. He went on to imply that she had lovers and male visitors at her home. None of the locals agreed with this, as we've talked about. There's no record of any men visiting Sophie's home unless they're people that she's taken with her from France. The timeline for the 23rd of December comes very strange when you add in Ian Bailey's account. We know that Sophie's body was found at 10. Bailey said he'd received a call at 20 to 2 that afternoon from Eddie Cassidy, a journalist associate, saying there had been a murder of a foreign national nearby. And was it near Bailey's house? And Bailey says that Cassidy told him it was a French lady who lived near him. And so Bailey therefore knew it must be Sophie. And that's how he found out about the murder. But police, when they were talking to everyone, spoke to a lady who was supposed to have a turkey delivered by Bailey that morning, who rang her. She said he'd rung her at 11:30 or 12 o'clock to say he couldn't deliver the turkey because, quote, there had been a murder. He then rang another man who the police spoke to, who he was also supposed to deliver a turkey to, at 11:30 to say he couldn't deliver the turkey that morning because there had been a murder, and he sounded quite excited about it. So that doesn't fit. Bailey says he finds out from Eddie Cassidy at 20 to 2 in the afternoon, but we know that around 11:30 that morning, he'd made 2 cancellations of turkey deliveries, and the reason was because there had been a murder. The police then discover that at 10:45, a couple called and spoke to Bailey's girlfriend, Jules, to ask where he was, whether it was about turkeys or whatever. And she said to them, quote, he's off investigating a murder. So then at 10:45, he's obviously said to his girlfriend that there's been a murder. Ian denies all of this and says he doesn't know anything until the Eddie Cassidy call. He arrives at the crime scene at 2:20 p.m, as far as we know. Not surprising. He's been notified of a murder near him 40 minutes before. He lives 3 miles down the road. He's been told by Eddie Cassidy that it's a Frenchwoman. There's only one Frenchwoman living down the road from him. This is all normal. As an investigative journalist, of course he's going to go straight there. But what was noted by police at the scene on the day was that Ian Bailey was behaving very strangely and didn't ask any questions. He didn't stay for very long. He didn't ask any questions. A journalist arriving at this catastrophic scene would not disappear without asking anything. Ian Bailey says that the police were very aggressive and just sat opposite him repeating, "You did it, you did it, you did it." The police rightly say, why would they do that? Seems like a very odd way to conduct an investigation. And they wanted answers for this circumstantial evidence. And while he's being interviewed, they go and search his house. They don't find any evidence in the house, but nor do they find anything from the list of clothes that he's wearing on the day. They've been given this list of the clothes that he was wearing. They need to bring them in. They don't find any of the clothes, including the boots. They then go to the studio, which is about 250 yards down the track from the house. And at the back of the studio, they find a fire scene. Bailey would deny that there had been any fire recently, but a witness, Louise Kennedy, came forward and spoke to the police. She'd been out walking on the 26th of December and saw a fire burning behind the studio. She could clearly see a mattress burning and thought this was really weird. And so she had gone forward and told the police. This is one of the bits of evidence that all linked back to Bailey. She thought it was a weird time to be burning stuff, weird to be burning a mattress and clothes. Ian said he had a fire earlier in December, but not near Christmas. But the investigators could tell that the ash was more recent. Why lie? Police then went through the ash. They found mattress springs, buttons from a coat, jeans, boots, all the clothes that they had on their list of clothes that he was wearing that day. Why burn your bed? Why burn your clothing just outside your back door? I throw old clothes away or take them to a charity shop. It would never cross my mind to burn them. It does mean that there's no DNA. Throughout the whole thing, Ian Bailey's lies are a problem. It's not necessarily that there's a load of evidence. It's his lying. He is the one that consistently lies. He says he has an alibi for the night of the murder. He went out with his girlfriend Jules. They come home. They go to bed. That's where they stay all night. But police are not convinced. Jules is then arrested and taken in for questioning. Police believe that she was being coercively controlled by Bailey, so interviewing her away from him and in a safe place would maybe get some more information. She told police that the night of the murder, that they were driving home and he stops the car and look, on top of a hill that looks out to sea, but it also looks down onto Sophie's house. And he notes that there are lights on at Alfie Lyon's house and a gable light on at Sophie's. And so he says to Jules, well, maybe Alfie Lyon's is having a party. We should go and have a look. She says, I don't want to. I want to go home. And Bailey then gets in the car and says to her, quote, "Something bad is going to happen tonight." They then go home and go to bed. Now, Ian says he went to bed and stayed there all night, and Jules initially said the same thing, but was clearly nervous. Eventually, she admits to the police that about an hour after they'd gone to bed, Ian got up, and that she didn't then see him again until he bought her a cup of coffee at 9 a.m. When he did come in, he had a fresh wound on his forehead that she had not noticed the day before. When faced with this information, Ian then said, "Oh, yeah, I forgot. I got up and wrote in the kitchen, and then I went to the studio to carry on writing." After 12 hours, according to Irish law, they had to let Bailey go. There's insufficient evidence to charge him. Now, most people would avoid publicity? No. Bailey is happy to speak to the press, and in a number of interviews he gives, he says, quote, "I'd never met her, never spoken to her." And you can see this in a number of interviews. A friend of Bailey's is aware there are loads of rumours going around. There's rumours that Bailey's seen, calling to the moon and blah, 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 all this eccentric stuff going on. And he feels that Bailey has a right to know about these rumours. I never understand people who think that someone has a right to know the awful things that people are saying about them. They don't. There's nothing they can do about it. Why tell them? Anyway, so he goes up to Bailey's house. He finds Bailey pissed, and he tells them what the people of the town are saying, and that, Bailey's the main suspect. And he said Bailey then got really angry. He was so clenching his fist so hard his knuckles were white. And Bailey then accuses this friend of killing Sophie. And he says, quote, "You'd had a few drinks. You'd seen her tight ass in the shop and you wanted to give her one. So you went up to the house to proposition her, and when she turned you down, you chased her down and bashed her in the back of the head." The friend said it was like a confession and absolutely terrifying. And he said, I realised I'd been sitting with someone really terrifying. It was a side to Bailey he'd never seen before. But he wasn't the only one that had seen Bailey falling apart. On New Year's Eve, a local couple were having drinks in a pub, and they got into a conversation with Ian and Jules. And it was after dark, after midnight, and Bailey started crying and hugging the man named Richard Shelley, and then apparently said, I did it, I went too far. And this was so horrifying. And they were so scared that the Shelleys physically got up and ran away. A local woman went to another party. She's a psychic, and she went to a party held by a German friend. There were lots of people there, including Ian Bailey. And the lady said, I'm not a psychic, so I don't know, but she said psychics will tell you that they will be compelled to say things, and when you're compelled to say something, you have to say it. And she said she arrived and she saw him, and she was compelled to say to him, "You murdered that woman." And she said he looked her straight in the eye and said, "I didn't mean for everyone to get involved." Another time, Ian gives a lift to a local 14-year-old boy. Because of the remote houses around the main town, it was and the hilly, it rises up from the sea. So a lot of the times people would be giving lifts up and down the hill. And so it was totally normal for the 14-year-old boy to be given a lift, and he gets a lift with Ian one day. And he said, he got in the car, and Ian seemed clearly really stressed and like he'd been drinking. And the kid found this very awkward. And so he casually sort of said, "Oh, how's work going?" And Ian responded with, "I went up there and bashed her brains in with a rock." The child got home. He was really shocked. He was very quiet. He didn't say anything to his mother because he didn't want to admit that he'd been in a car with someone who'd been drinking. Classic 14-year-old boy. But the next morning he tells his mother, and they decide that they should tell the police. And it's all of these people informing the police separately that's very interesting. They don't tell other people. It's all done privately and separately. None of them know that anyone else has gone into the police to tell them. We'll find all of that out later on. So, on the 27th of January 1998, Ian Bailey is arrested again. By law, the police only have 2 opportunities to interview a suspect. Each time can last up to 12 hours, so that's it. This is the last time that they can bring in Ian Bailey. And at the time, a friend asks Jules, "Do you think Ian did it?" And she said, "I don't know." When told that a lot of people had come forward to say that he'd confessed to them, Ian Bailey said that he was being sarcastic or ironic. they seem to basically face him with a lot of, we've had these people saying that you confessed. We've had this person saying you said this. And they really want him to confess to them. But he knows that this is all circumstantial evidence. So again, he is released after 12 hours with no charge. So basically, he's confessed numerous times. He's lied to the police a lot. He doesn't really have an alibi. But they can't charge him with anything. After his second release, Bailey invites the press into his house to give interviews. He needs this attention. And again, he reiterates that he only knew Sophie by sight as someone had pointed her out to him. He'd never spoken to her. And having willingly and continually talked to the press and written numerous articles implying that Sophie had a string of lovers and it was her way of life that led to her death, he then decides that he's been a victim of defamation by the press. And in December 2003, Ian Bailey takes libel action against 7 Irish and British newspapers. He wants a big payout. He wants his day in the sun, literally. But then the newspapers involved apply to get hold of the police files, which they do. And then all the witnesses in the police files are called to court. Their privacy is blown. It's then that the court and the public hear all of this circumstantial evidence that had led to the police questioning Ian Bailey twice. Some people had thought they were picking on him. They'd selected someone who fit the bill and were trying to set him up for the case. But now everyone can see all of this evidence, all of the witnesses coming forward. And yes, it is all circumstantial, but it's quite detailed and there's quite a lot of it. And the witnesses' stories don't change. The timings, they're still firm on their timings. Remember, this is 2003. The murder took place in 1996. Their stories haven't changed. No lies are uncovered. No discrepancies are found. The only person who's caught lying is Ian Bailey, and everyone can see all of the sort of details of this story now. Now, Marie Farrell, do you remember she was Fiona, is a very important witness. She had seen Bailey on the 22nd by the bridge, and she also said that he had threatened her numerous times if she did not change her statement. She made complaints to the police of intimidation, all of which were logged on the file. She said he would sit outside her house in his car and make cutthroat gestures at her. Witnesses actually arrived at her shop once and found her shop closed, which was unusual, and they knocked on the door to make sure she was all right. And she comes down and she's in an absolute state, and he's been outside making this cutthroat motion at her through the window. And there are lots of witnesses and neighbours to say that he's threatened them, and a lot of women were terrified of him, and some women actually left the village and didn't come back because they were scared of Ian Bailey. And this all comes out during this trial. It's also during this trial that the public hear how he has beaten up Jules, his girlfriend, once so badly in 1996, about 6 months before the murder of Sophie Tuscon de Plantier, that she nearly lost an eye. One of her daughters goes round to a neighbour's house and says, "Please, can you come and take my mother to the hospital?" And he goes round and he is so traumatised when talking about this experience that he cries. This is quite a down-to-earth guy, and he cries when talking about this. He says her eye was swollen to the size of a grapefruit. Her lip was torn away from the gum. Quote, half her hair was out of her head. Her daughters are there to see all of this. And yeah, it's about 6 months before the murder. And neighbours often saw her bruised or with black eyes and know that he beats her up. When faced with this, Ian Bailey, of course, I mean, this almost makes me angrier than anything else. It makes me really angry. Seeing him interviewed about this, I was glad I wasn't in the room, He's asked about this specific time where, she nearly loses her eye. And he says that Jules had been drunk and had come at him and he'd defended himself. And that's how she got so injured. What to see you next Tuesday. My mother listens, so I'm not going to use that word, but it's the only word to describe anyone who does that to someone and then implies that it was because she was drunk and she was violent and he was defending himself. He's 6'3". He is a big man, and half her hair was out of her head. Her eye was the size of a grapefruit. You don't need to use that kind of force. Ugh. Anyway, Ian Bailey loses his libel case. What a fucking idiot. What it does is it shows he is violent with women. He is a liar. He has all of these. There are so many witnesses who have stories of Ian Bailey confessing to them. It's not a conspiracy. No one knows about this until this trial. And so when the trial is over, everyone waits for a prosecution to be announced. It never happens. Meanwhile, in France, Sophie's son, who's been so distressed by her murder, obviously, and is spurred into action with her friends and family. In 2007, he and Sophie's brother started an association to find out what happened to her. And this association meets monthly, and it's her friends and family, and they're determined to get results. Now, having been confident in the Irish police, they are amazed that nothing has happened. They've seen the trial, the libel trial. They've seen all the witness information. They cannot believe that Ian Bailey has not gone to court. Now, in the UK and Ireland, you have to prove without reasonable doubt that someone is guilty of a crime. In France, it's more what is described as a bouquet of evidence. The French investigation into this crime begins in 2008, and pretty soon they have their bouquet of evidence. Now, there is a really strange twist. Marie Farrell, aka Fiona, who has gone to the police numerous times about being threatened by Ian Bailey, about seeing Ian Bailey by the bridge, about seeing him follow Sophie, and who has gone to the libel trial and maintained the same story. She now retracts her statement. She said that on the night that she claimed to have seen Bailey by the bridge, she was with a man who was not her husband. That she says there was nothing going on, but it's 3 a.m. She's with a crime who's not her husband and didn't want police to force her to identify. Didn't want, so her reputation was compromised, and the police forced her to identify their preferred suspect, which was Ian Bailey. What is strange about this is that she was the one who initially went to the police with this series of anonymous phone calls. Why go to the police and lie and say it was to cover up because you were with a man who wasn't your husband, which they wouldn't know about? It was 3 a.m. Why call them anonymously to cover up for an incident they don't know about anyway? Why put yourself in? What made her suddenly change her mind? Also, we have witnesses, people who appeared at her house and found her locked in and shaking when she had been terrorised by Bailey. Was this all just a plan? It seems very strange. And at the same time, a lot of criticisms falling on the police, that the crime scene wasn't properly preserved. They had people walking all over it. Evidence has since gone missing, including the massive metal gate with bloodstains on it. Disappeared. No one knows where that is. Now, in 2011, it comes out that the DPP, the prosecutor in Ireland, who has to say, the police take their evidence to the prosecutor, who then will say, right, this can go to trial, or not. It came out that the DPP said there's nowhere near enough evidence to warrant an arrest of Ian Bailey. And throughout the interviews and the ensuing years, the DPP argued the credibility of every single witness. Why didn't the 14-year-old boy tell his mother immediately? Well, 14-year-old boys who are shocked, who are scared, who think they're going to get in trouble, don't tell people immediately. But actually, telling his mum the next morning is pretty immediate, I would think. Every witness is disparaged by the DPP, but he seems unmoved by the fact that Ian Bailey consistently lied. It didn't have an alibi himself, has burnt the clothes that he was wearing on the day that Sophie was murdered. That doesn't bother the prosecutor. It doesn't bother him that this man has a proven violence against women. He says he's recorded as saying that's not relevant. Domestic violence is just a fact of life. So the police hand all the files over to the French inquiry and the association. And in another trial, Marie Farrell is asked to name the man that she's with that night. The judge says, okay, if you didn't see Ian Bailey because you made that story up to cover for being out with a man who wasn't your husband, who is this man? And she cries, she bursts into tears, she refuses to, she leaves the witness stand, she storms out of the court. Her lawyer then persuades her to go back into the court, and the judge says, this is a court of law. You have to name who that person is, or you're going to prison. And so she names the man, and we don't know who she names, but it's someone who has such a rock hard alibi for that time that it's not. He's not definitely not with her. And so they're like, why are you giving us the name of someone you definitely weren't with? The whole thing is completely bonkers. And this is at another defamation trial that Ian Bailey is taking. I believe it's against the police. And Marie Farrell is his prime witness. And he's called her, to say that she was intimidated by the police. They made her question they made her say that Ian Bailey, she'd seen him and all of this, and then she crumbles. She gives the name of a man that is clearly false. She is behaving very weirdly, and the whole thing is just a bit of a shit show. And I don't necessarily think it's the police's problem. I think it's the prosecutor. And what really angers me is Ian Bailey has taken the focus away from Sophie. Had he been arrested for questioning and then tried to get back to a normal life, I'm sure it's deeply unpleasant. That would have been one thing. But he continuously courted the press and talked about himself, and the focus has just not been on Sophie. Everyone's trying to make sense of these tiny pieces of a jigsaw, putting it together. And there is no other suspect. Another woman comes forward when the trial in France begins. Another woman comes forward, and she was a friend of Ian Bailey's girlfriend's daughter. And she was staying with the Baileys that Christmas. And she said two things really stood out, and she didn't talk to the police about them at the time. I believe she was living in LA. So, she goes off, she doesn't really think more about it, but she says that she remembers the scratches on Ian Bailey's hands and forearms, and says, they were not caused by a Christmas tree, and that thing on his head was not caused by a turkey. She says, quote, she would comfortably say they were caused by something like thorns. She also said that she observed something that was very odd, that in the shower, there was a bucket, and in the bucket was a dark coat usually worn by Ian, soaking. And she was like, it was just kind of weird. It just sat in a bucket soaking, and then she didn't see it. She was like, it's an odd thing to be doing over Christmas. Anyway, so there's another bit of evidence. Also, we know that Ian Bailey says in the press that he's never met her before, and this doesn't fit with what her friends and family in France know. Sophie's best friend in France came forward when she heard this. She knew that Sophie had met Ian Bailey. Sophie had told her about, quote, a madman who wrote poems, who wanted to meet her to talk about his work. She'd found him strange and worrying and unsettling. And another film producer friend of Sophie's also came forward and said that he'd had a conversation with Sophie that had really affected him. It was just before she left to go to Ireland, and he was worried. And she had said that there was a journalist living near her who wanted to talk to her about his work, but she was interested in stories of domestic violence. So I think he felt very uncomfortable that Sophie perhaps knew that he was violent to his girlfriend and was going to talk to him based on the understanding that she wanted to talk about his work, but was then going to say, so you hit your girlfriend. You know, it's a dangerous situation to put yourself in. In May 2019, the French, unable to get anyone from the Irish legal team to participate, had a trial for Ian Bailey in absentia. It's worth mentioning, all the witnesses went. They felt they owed it to Sophie, and they felt like they had a right to be to a trial and to be heard. You know, they'd only been heard in a trial organised by Ian Bailey, the libel trial. They felt like, as I do, the whole thing with Ian Bailey and him taking the papers to court and him courting the papers before that has taken away from Sophie. And so they travelled to France, and the French court holds that Marie Farrell's original testimony was likely to be the truth, though she didn't go, obviously. And they actually felt very responsible that they hadn't protected her more from Ian. They believed that almost the opposite of what she said was true, in that her original testimony was correct and he had somehow intimidated her so much that she then did change her story. And Ian Bailey is found guilty of the murder of Sophie Tuscon de Plantier, and by rights should be serving his 25-year prison sentence in France. It's an incredibly emotional day for the family and for her friends. And the French government then put in an extradition request for Ian Bailey to come and serve his sentence. In October 2020, the Irish High Court rules that Ian Bailey cannot be extradited. In April 2021, Jules releases a statement that she and Ian have separated. Her silence throughout this is very noteworthy. Throughout the two court cases that Ian goes through, one against the police, one against the papers for libel, he is supported by her. She goes to court with him. But she doesn't seem to have any close friends or have spoken to the police. And in the Netflix documentary that I saw, he is still in the house. She is not. I find that very sinister because it was her house long before he turned up. And why is he now there and she's not? I don't think he's done anything to her, but I wouldn't be surprised if she just cut her losses and went. He was obviously incredibly abusive to live with. People have thought she was coercively controlled. The police obviously thought she was coercively controlled. Distressingly, Sophie's best friend in Paris had, before Sophie's death, had a psychic around for drinks, and the psychic saw a picture of Sophie on the wall and said, quote, "Ooh la la, that woman will die a violent death when she's 40. And Sophie's friend couldn't believe it. She said, she didn't really even think anything of it because Sophie was so, quote, vibrant. And that is a word that is used a lot to describe Sophie. And it seems that her friends and family, and indeed a lot of those who knew her in Ireland, cannot quite believe what's happened to her. She's this vibrant, beautiful, intelligent woman who just was bashed in on a remote road in Ireland, and nothing has been done about it, seemingly. Sophie Tuscon de Plantier's son still goes to her house. He says it's like going to stay with her. She's very present there. And Ian Bailey still lives there, is seen around the town. And some people obviously see him. Some people say they avoid the town square where he is often seen. And as one person puts it, it's a real testament to what the town is like, because they are very accepting. He walks there. He believe in the thing of innocent until proven guilty. And he has not been proven guilty. And that is the distressing story of Sophie Tuscon de Plantier. Now, I very much know that this sort of thing is all about using the facts to find the culprit, not finding a culprit and trying to make the facts fit. But once you take certain things into account, it's very hard to find anyone else who could be responsible. It had to be someone who knew the area. It had to be someone who knew the area very well, because someone from Cork got lost repeatedly on the way. So it had to be someone who knew the area, who knew that her house was up this track. It had to be someone who felt confident going to her house at night. And I just feel like the sinister thing that Bailey says to the friend, you went to her house to try it on with her, essentially. And when she turned you down, you chased her down and got carried away and bashed her head in. And he says it was like he was confessing and it was terrifying. And I just think, yeah, I can totally see that happening. I can totally see an arrogant, drunk man approaching her house to see if he could try it on with her, and being obviously a violent person, being so furious and just maybe the door shut. We don't know whether the door kind of shut behind her and locked her out, or if that just happened overnight, after she died. But if she's running away and screaming for help, and you are drunk and panicked and violent and you just want her to stop, it's not unreasonable. And the only person who's lied about knowing her, who's lied about where they were, who's consistently inserted themselves into there's only one person. There is, they narrowed it down from 1,000 people interviewed, 54 people on the suspect list, 10 people on the short list. All of them had alibis, watertight alibis. There's only one person who doesn't, whose alibi changed. And it's that sort of thing where if Ian Bailey is innocent and has lived since 1996 with this, that is terrible. That is absolutely terrible. because it has tainted his life. But part of me thinks there's no smoke without fire. But all we can go on is the facts. And the facts are, it was very remote. It was not pre-planned. So that's all we know. That's all we factually know. I'd love to know what you think. You can check out my reading list in the link below. You can check out merch in the link below. Any reviews you give is really helpful, recommending it to your friends. You can email me, themondaynightrevue@gmail.com. You can come and check out the Patreon where there's loads of extra content. And until next time, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seat before you drive.